While this is a response video, I will highlight the sections I have an issue with, so you don't need to watch the original video. As a disclaimer, while I do have some objections and some observations here, I will state upfront that they do not change the overall conclusion much. I'm in full agreement with the fact that most of us are in a position where we could afford to do far more, and we should. I will expand more on that later.
Imagine you're on a walk, alone, in the middle of the day, and you pass by a small body of water. You begin to hear thrashing and screaming, and you realize that the sound is coming from a drowning child just a few meters from where you're stood. Luckily, the water is pretty shallow, and it'll be really easy for you to wade in and save the child. But you'll ruin your shoes and your trousers. You'll get them all muddy and you'll have to replace them. Your shoes cost maybe $100, so you decide not to wade in and not to save the child. You let them die because you want to save your money. But hold on, isn't that just the most evil thing you've ever heard? A person refusing to save this child's life because they want to save $100 to spend on their shoes?
This is incorrect. I suppose I can't blame Alex for having this misconception. Almost everyone thinks this way. When you survey people by asking them how much does it cost to save a life, you get answers like these. Let's consider these figures for a moment. While foreign aid is not a straight charity, I think it serves as a useful point of comparison here. The United States foreign aid budget is about $50 billion, of which 35 goes to economic assistance. At $40 a life, that translates to 1 billion lives saved per year. Or does it? You can see how the numbers just aren't adding up here. Do you really think we could somehow save 1 billion lives if we just use the US foreign aid budget more efficiently somehow? These cannot be the real numbers. There aren't even 1 billion deaths per year in the entire world. What's not adding up here is that even the 90th percentile dramatically underestimates the cost of saving a life. The real cost of reliably saving a life ranges from somewhere around $2,300 to $7,500, and these numbers are for the most cost-effective charities in the world, the lowest hanging fruit. For the rest of this video, I'll use an average of $5,000 as a shorthand for the average cost of saving a life. Even for people living in affluent Western societies, that's a lot of money. Depending on the data source you choose for this comparison, this represents roughly half a year to 2 years of average household spending on all entertainment. Now, is a year of entertainment for a household worth more than a human life? Of course not, but it does dramatically change the nature of the comparison. Here's what I describe as, for the first time, a true analogy of the situation. Once again, we are at a lake. A child is drowning in front of you, but this is no ordinary lake. There are warning signs here. The lake is poisoned, radioactive, or some such thing. If you take a short dip in it, you will pay a heavy price for it. You will be severely poisoned, perhaps not to the point where you'll risk your own life, but certainly the next several months are going to be miserable. You might be capable of working, but it's going to be so bad that it's going to feel like an almost entirely joyless existence. Do you have to jump in? It's obviously heroic to do so, but a moral obligation? I find that claim dubious. We don't require people to run into burning buildings to save lives. Some of you might claim that's different, that we're not required to run into burning buildings because that risks injury. But I'd argue that mental health is just as real and just as important, and it is our mental health that we're putting at risk here if we go too hard into the altruistic hermit lifestyle. After all, we just finished running a giant global experiment on what a year of severely restricted entertainment does to people. The results are not pretty. Some would say this is explained by economic anxiety, but even in households that are very economically secure, almost half of all people report negative mental health impacts. You could argue it's about the fear of contagion, but in surveys such as this one, conducted on Italian students, a group of people as removed from economic anxiety and health risks as one can find, we find that stress related to fear of contagion was relatively low, but overall global stressors were still significant. As well, of course, entertainment is the most superfluous spending that we do, the one we can most afford to cut, and everything else would likely have an even more dramatic impact on our quality of life. In short, the problem with the drowning child analogy, in its original form, is that saving lives just isn't easy. It is, in fact, terribly difficult, even when we use the most efficient means available to us. It would be nice if we lived in a world where a couple $1 billion was sufficient to prevent all preventable death, but we do not. Of course, I think it should go without saying that I'm talking about average people with average means here. If your net worth is such that you could save tens, hundreds or thousands of lives, or even more, and not even notice a difference in your quality of life, then yeah, you gotta do something. It would be wrong not to do so. Now, onto my second point. Allow me to play a clip. This struck me as very strange.
Likely it is that people will ever comply with a moral theory is independent from the truth of the moral theory.
And the moral theory is true regardless of
whether anybody will ever act on it.
While Cosmic Skeptic ends up at a similar conclusion to me, he takes a different route there, and I want to highlight the differences in my reasoning process here. Yes, the demandingness objection is valid. Of course the difficulty matters. How could it possibly not? I don't even understand the idea of a useful moral theory where the difficulty of living up to it is not taken into account. Peter Singer says that it's true regardless of difficulty, but I'd argue it's true only in the sense in which a physics problem about a spherical cow in a vacuum is true. It bears no relation to the real world. A useful moral theory has to consider the capabilities of moral actors. I think this is much easier to see if we turn our attention to physical challenges, so allow me to use that as an example first. Imagine the following scenario. You see a child a couple hundred meters away from you. Some unavoidable disaster is heading their way. Maybe a boulder is falling on them. Maybe they're on train tracks and the train won't stop in time. Even if you shout, the child is not going to hear you or pay attention. There's nothing you can humanly do to stop this from happening. If you are Superman, maybe you could do something, but you're not. On the other hand, imagine that you can save a child's life just by reaching down and pulling the kid out of the water. 10 seconds of perfectly human effort. To assert that the difficulty of living up to a moral theory doesn't matter is to say that these two scenarios are morally equivalent, that you're just as bad of a person for not being Superman as you are for not exercising a tiny bit of effort to save a life. I hope I don't have to strain myself here to convince you that this is obviously absurd. Of course the difficulty matters. How could it not? We all operate within the limits of physics, biology, and yes, our own minds. That's because shifting this problem into the realm of cognition does not change these things. Let us repeat the scenario. You can save a life by either doing some simple arithmetic or by beating Magnus Carlsen in chess 10 times in a row. Are those scenarios morally equivalent? Of course not. Even suppose that we turn this into an issue of willpower, self-control, the ability to withstand hardship, deprivation, and temptation. For some reason, people tend to treat our psychological limitations as somehow less real, less tangible than our physical limitations, but they're just as real and just as tangible. If we accept that we are electrochemical processes of the brain, and I think Alex and I agree on this point, then our neurons surely have finite capabilities in the same way in which every other part of our body has finite capabilities. We should respect that our minds have limits in the same way in which our bodies have limits. A moral theory that disregards the difficulty of living up to it may be true in a vacuum for perfect utilitarian robots, but it's false for humans. It's false in the same way in which it is incorrect advice to tell someone that the best way to become a good runner is to run as hard and as fast and as long as you can every single moment of every single day. That is a recipe for constant, ongoing injuries that will become hugely counterproductive to your long-term goals. The best training program that will maximize your results over a lifetime is a smart program, one that gradually builds up your stamina and considers the limits of your body, one that implements rest days, perhaps even rest weeks, one that implements things that aren't just more running, such as resistance training. It is frankly useless to ask ourselves the question, but what would a running training program look like for Wolverine? The best training program for your altruism is also a smart program, one that respects that you're a physical creature with limits, that your brain has limits that are just as real as those of your muscles, that you need joy and fun and good times and some breaks too. You're not going to do the most good possible if, after 6 months of attempted altruistic hermitage, you become depressed and completely burn out. Perhaps I'm wrong in my read of the situation here, but the impression I got is that Cosmic Skeptic seems to consider this conclusion a compromise. I would argue otherwise. It is not even remotely selfish to respect those limits. It is, in fact, the most altruistic thing you can do, to consider the long-term view of what you're hoping to achieve, not just today, but over a lifetime. There is one more point I'd like to raise here in defense of having some chill in our actions. To do that, we'll talk a little bit about AI safety, so-called satisficers and maximizers. To introduce the topic, let us talk about King Midas first. Yeah, King Midas, the one from the myth. What would actually happen to him after he received his gift of turning anything he touched into gold? He would begin suffocating as the insides of his lungs turned air into gold. He would not remain upright for very long, and eventually, as he fell and some exposed fragment of his skin touched the ground, he would turn the entire earth into gold. Now, gold is a far heavier metal than the average density of the planet, dense enough in fact that the gravitational pull would crush the atmosphere. This newly denser atmosphere would reach a temperature that would destroy all life on the planet, except for perhaps the most extreme of extremophiles. You probably didn't expect this apocalyptically cosmic end to the story of King Midas. That's because this story is not constrained by typical human common sense or our tendency to bring things down to a human scale, or a desire by the writer to deliver the original moral of the story. And this is in fact the exact problem with unconstrained AI. They go places you don't expect on a potentially cosmic scale because, like this version of the story, they simply have no chill. AIs like these we would call maximizers. They have some goal and no obstacles towards realizing that goal, no limits, no matter how disastrous the consequences become for everyone else, because the limits have not been programmed in. Now, what is a satisficer? If a maximizer is an AI with a goal of, for example, earn as much money as you can, then a satisficer might be an AI with a goal of, for example, earn $1 million. You can likely guess yourself here that the consequences of the latter are likely far less catastrophic. Now, to return to the topic of altruism, I think the reason Singer's conclusion struck us as so unintuitive is that most of us really are goodness satisficers. That is, most of us think that we should do some amount of good, but we don't need to do the most good possible, while Singer is proposing that we should be maximizers. This is another case where we have to consider the limitations of the moral agent, that is, us. Spoiler from AI safety research, satisficers don't turn out to be an adequate solution to the problem of AI safety, but while they're not safe, they are inarguably safer than maximizers. I think everyone who pays any attention whatsoever to history or whose moral outlook has evolved over time realizes that we can be horribly wrong about what is good and evil. Even today, there are regimes enforcing what they consider to be just and right, while the rest of us look on in horror, to say nothing of the regimes of the past. As such, I would fundamentally conclude that even if you want to be a maximizer, you can't be a straightforward maximizer. You have to consider your limits and the fact that your moral outlook may evolve over time, that it's inherently more dangerous to be a maximizer and some level of caution is warranted. As such, any smart, pragmatic maximizer of moral goodness, at least one that operates within the boundaries of human limits, has to evolve into a satisficer and leave themselves some room to breathe. To summarize my thoughts here, a moral theory has to acknowledge that some tasks are possible and some are not. Tasks that are impossible are not moral questions at all. Whether you lift a train of a dying child is not a question of morality. A binary divide is not sufficient, however, because we also have to manage our fatigue, both in the short term and in the long term. Trying to sprint a marathon is not how you get to the finish line the fastest. A singular focus on that goal may also make you consider cheating and other unsavory means, which is why it's safer to not attempt to maximize in this way. CosmicSkeptic noticed that as the demandingness increased, our obligations lessened, and what I just said is the justification for why that is the case. Leaving yourself some room to breathe and investing resources in your own development is likely to allow you to do more good in the future as well. Investments pay dividends, and if you're interested in this topic, chances are you'll be morally wiser in a year or 5 years from now. Of course, you still need to do something today, because if you procrastinate today, you are going to keep procrastinating 10 years from now and telling yourself that you'll just do it in the distant future then as well. Overall, by no means should my response here be taken as an easy excuse to pat yourself on the back and tell yourself that you're doing your all and it's fine. Much as it is with exercise, very few people have the problem of overdoing it. The overwhelming majority of us do far too little. A permission to indulge yourself is not a permission for unlimited indulgence. A permission to wait and grow wiser is not a permission for unlimited delay. You don't become a good runner by doing rest days 7 days a week either, or by telling yourself that you'll train in a year when the conditions are more favorable. You need to actually train today. You don't become a good person by never doing good things either. You need to actually do good things today. Not a maximum amount of good things, but some good things. If this is genuinely beyond your means, fair enough, but know that I'm addressing the typical person here. If you're watching this from a developed country, you will on average have approximately 5 hours of leisure time a day, and while saving a life is extremely expensive, charities are not exaggerating when they say they can have a major positive impact on people's quality of life for a cheap price. You have the time and the money to help. $7 for anti-malaria medication. $5 for one net, $1 for vitamin A supplementation, $47 for a full set of vaccinations for a child, $1 to deworm a child from parasitic infection. Those are some of the examples of top charities. Those are not lives, perhaps, but each of those interventions has the potential to spare someone weeks or months of misery down the line. Isn't devoting some fraction of your entertainment budget to that worth it? As for your time, why not spend some time volunteering at your local charities? Directly working with your own hands is the sort of thing that people tend to find psychologically satisfying. It contributes to their mental well-being and improves their mental health outcomes. This might not be the most efficient form of help if you consider it solely from the perspective of monetary efficiency. But as we've already discussed, this form of help may be the most efficient from a point of view that acknowledges the limits of the brain you're working with. Here's the fun part. It's worth it even from a selfish perspective if you're a psychologically normal human. After all, do you think that you will be happier helping or drooling in front of Netflix? I think the answer is obvious. Altruism feels good. For some strange reason, I think this is a conclusion that people shy away from, as if feeling good about your altruism diminished it somehow, or made it worse or less valuable. In my opinion, this is as baffling as thinking that a marriage is diminished if those married are genuinely in love, instead of viewing their partnership as some joyless obligation. To me, it seems like an obvious win-win. If your own well-being is improved when you aid the well-being of others, isn't that even better than just improving the well-being of others? In short, do more. There's every reason to, very few reasons not to, and yes, you need to do something. Not everything, but something.